My name's John Worthington. I think I've met a lot of you. My background is in music technology, starting at Apple. I worked on the 2GS, which had the sound chip from the Ensoniq Mirage, which was an interesting thing to stick in a computer in 1986. I did the Macintosh MIDI Manager, which was MIDI showing up in the operating system. I was a project leader for QuickTime. And QuickTime was interesting because it was the start of my career in video and animation because the Beatles sued Apple. And all of a sudden, everyone who was working on music stuff didn't work on music because music no longer officially existed. So I'm going to talk about expressive electronic percussion. My current project is an instrument I designed called the djembe. I'll be showing it a little bit tomorrow. But that caused me to go down this rabbit hole, I think similar in a lot of ways to what Ed was doing with the bull roar, where you think about a physical instrument, you think about what the components of it are, and what sort of really matters in an instrument. And when you take expressive electronic percussion together, expressive and electronic makes sense, right? Especially here with the continuum, you understand how, electronic things can be expressive. And electronic and percussion makes sense. We've all seen electronic drums. Those three words together don't make a lot of sense, at least not in the musical instrument industry. And the reason for that is what Roger often refers to as people trying to make music with switches. And percussion's the place that suffers the most from it because, you're hitting things. And so most of my talks, which I'll apologize for in advance, devolve into a story. When I first started encountering electronic instruments, the world sort of looked like these two things, and the mini mode made sense to me. It had a keyboard. It was accessible in a way that a buchla wasn't. And I think part of that came about this idea that keyboards allowed you to leverage muscle memory. All those years that a keyboard player spent practicing and learning scales meant something. It allowed you to leverage common gestures. And that's really true on something like the continuum where the natural vibrato is natural because that's a common gesture across a lot of instruments. And so you intuitively go, oh, I get this. Or I get the fact that unless someone's done something unusual, pitch moves in a certain direction across the playing surface. And so when you sit down and play, there's a comment that made earlier about people just, I want to try it out. But part of the magic of this is for something that's a really, really deep instrument, you can play it at a NAMM show and it makes sense enough to go, I want to take that dive into the deep end of the swimming pool. Whereas, no one's going to pick up some instruments and go, I'll try it. If you pick up a violin and you go, okay, let's try this, you're never going to want to play a violin. There's a reason they start kids on violin, because they don't know better.
No choice.
No choice. And then also, the keyboards allowed you to leverage repertoire, right? And that's sort of important because if you don't have common gestures, if you don't have this leverage of muscle memory, everything becomes a new piece of music, and it's hard to translate that to people. And so if any of you have ever been to like a computer music conference, you will see lots of great pieces designed around interesting instruments, and that whole thing is one thing that never gets done again, because that instrument was designed for that piece, and you can't really play it on anything else. So I was very locked into that thinking. It changed a little bit actually at a computer music conference in 1987, which was at the University of Illinois. And I got to experience an early version of the Continuum, which I think was plugged into HEMA at the time. Yeah. And so my world about, I like synthesizers with keyboards and that, changed a lot, because here was this instrument that really wasn't a keyboard, but it was accessible, and it allowed you to do a lot of different things in really interesting ways. And so that caused me to rethink things, and what made things nice wasn't that the keyboard made things accessible, but it was really that instruments needed to have these properties, right? You need to be able to approach it. You need to be able to take what you know as a musician. You need to be able to, if you do something that's a common gesture, it has to do similar sorts of things, or that becomes a problem for people. And so if you don't do that, you can fall into sort of the controller trap, where it becomes perhaps a lovely construction kit, a lovely exercise in being able to do what you want, but often this daunting thing of, now I have too many degrees of freedom, and nothing's mapped out for me. I don't know how to approach the thing. And I think about this a lot as I'm designing my instrument, and I appreciate it a lot as I play with the Continuum. Because if you really don't model these things, it doesn't work very well. And this is really true of the instrument as well, that you can sit down and do, it makes sense. Someone can sit down and play with it and get enough positive feedback that they then want to move on to the next level. So, and this could be the start of any number of drummer jokes. So percussion is, right, you hit it, it go boom. And so that's the switch part. And for a lot of things, it doesn't go anywhere beyond that. Which is sad, because percussion is sort of all of our native instruments, right? The first sounds we really experience are heartbeats. All of us have probably gotten scolded in classes for drumming on tables.
He's drumming on the table.
Yeah, it happens. It happens. And so when I tried to really break this stuff down, and I'm new to the Continuum, with the djembe, was thinking a lot about, okay, if you're going to build a percussion instrument, and you can do anything, what are you going to do? Because you shouldn't try and do everything, or you just get lost. And the start of all this is rhythm. And rhythm for me really is placing sonic events in a controlled manner, right? You get to choose where you place these events in time. And this is easy for the Continuum, because the latency is very low. And this is something that gets lost a lot, and if you ever hang out in the percussion area of a NAMM show, which I wouldn't advise with a hangover.
Or at any time.
Pro tip. Yeah, at any time it's bad, but with a hangover it's really, really bad. I never realized how loud practice pads could be.
Oh, yeah.
But there's questions about latency. And latency is this total latency through the system, but it also has to do with where your amplifier is, right? Because you have this inescapable fact that sound moves at a constant rate through air. And so you have to account for that, and you're hearing it you know, in a PA system, maybe fairly far away from you. But the instant, you know, you need to be able to, in a predictable way, play rhythms. We can do that with switches. And you get that for free with an instrument like the Continuum, which is sort of nice. Dynamics. If you can't play loud and soft, you don't really have any opportunity of playing expressively. And this is one of these places where I've discovered, especially as I've been playing more with the Continuum, that I need to really sort of limit. You know, I talk about dynamics, and the initial thing someone will think is set everything wide open. And therein lies madness. And it's really about thinking about the playable range. And when you deal with acoustic instruments, you have that built in. Physically, you know, there's only so hard you can hit certain things. And at a certain point, they don't do anything different, you know. A bull roar will never get louder than a bull roar gets. And that's a function of the instrument, not necessarily the person playing it. So being able to control this is important, and it's an important thing to think about as you create sounds. And we're, like I said, we're still in this space where things can be kind of comfortable with that. Where it starts to get more complicated is when you start talking about pitches. And are there any like people who consider themselves primarily percussionists here, as opposed to, all right, a couple. So most people, if you've grown up playing a pitched instrument, it's natural to be able to think about this spread out over a keyboard or playing surface. And so you can think about pitch as an integral part of everything. With percussion, it usually requires some additional gesture or effort, right? It might be that we have different drums that are tuned different ways, so then it's reaching out and hitting different things. Or it could be something like a talking drum where you're doing an extra action to change the pitch, or a timpani. And of course it should be in tune, and I found with the Continuum in particular, rounding with percussion stuff is your friend. And this is maybe the opposite of the more melodic patches, where you, I find if I'm playing something melodic, you know, it's not just leaving the rounding off while you're practicing and then using it as a safety feature. You want that added expression. When you're doing percussion stuff, you're really playing with timing and dynamics a lot, and having the pitch be right there helps a lot. And this is especially true if you want to take a percussionist and have them play your instrument. And so the world with electronic percussion starts to split out into a couple of things, which is if you are playing a percussion part, whatever works. And some of the best, you know, electronic percussion players in Hollywood are actually piano players. And you'll watch these people and they'll have an entire library of percussion sounds mapped out on a MIDI keyboard. And they will have what looks like the craziest piano score you've ever seen in your life. And they sit down, they just play it. And what you're getting out of it is this amazing percussion track. You know, good luck setting a drummer down and having them do that. And it's, you know, the first time I saw it, I thought, well, this is a nice convenience for the particular person who was playing. they do that a lot on Broadway shows too for different weird things. So I had a friend who was playing a show and they had the Magic MIDI keyboard with all the splits, with all the different patches matched out to it, and you'd look at the book for, I think it was My Fair Lady or something. And it was this crazy piano chart that sounded like, if you read it, what it actually sounded like was nothing like what was on the page. So you have the world of whatever you do to get the production or get percussion out where you're playing. The other approach is you bring in a percussionist because you want them to do something, and you found a sound you like and you want played a certain way. This is where gestures become really important. This is where rounding becomes really important. This is where, you know, taking the strike area and being mindful of the fact that you want to make it larger than what it is. Because that really fine motor control that a violinist has, you aren't going to find in a lot of percussionists. And especially not in people who play with sticks. And especially not people over a certain age. And this sort of surprised me, but 4 years ago, they passed the point where electronic percussion was outselling acoustic drum sets in the industry. And for a lot of these kids who grew up on video games, they grew up with electronic kits. And timbre and volume are completely decoupled from how hard you're hitting it. So they played very precisely with small muscle movements. And that's changing. Whereas you take a small pad and you take someone my age and have them hit it, and they're like, I can't hit it because I play from here, right? And so I found with a continuum that really if I'm making a patch that I want someone to be able to play percussively, you know, even if it's finger strikes, it's going to be wide. And most percussionists don't, you know, tabla players aside, who are sort of mutants, you know, one of the things we get with the djembe is you get very different waveforms out of hands and sticks. And I thought I had a lovely algorithm for that until these tabla masters started playing it. And they can hit with a finger, it looks exactly like a stick. So that's a different thing. Playing with the rounding is really, really important. And starting to think about what pitch gestures are. And one of the things that I hadn't quite worked out and I got from Ed last night was using zones. And this ability to, you know, I was playing with this this morning, the ability to split things and say, all right, I'm going to control my pitch for a talking drum thing with one region, and then be able to play the percussive stuff in another place. That starts to become a natural gesture. As soon as you start saying, I want to play my talking drum part with multiple fingers spread over things, you can do that, but it's going to sound different and feel different. Because it kind of is different, and even if you're trying to slide in between, or use, you know, the Z pressure to control the pitch, you end up with this very different thing. And so I find more and more as I start designing sounds for percussion stuff, having to think about how a percussionist would play it and how the physical instrument would respond makes a huge difference in getting a result that's believable. And the thing that goes along with that is timbre. Different types of strikes sound different on acoustic percussion instruments. How you hold it changes the sound. And so being able to use a zone for changing the filter, you know, if I take something like an udu, which is a clay drum, depending on how I hold it or how I mute it, I'm going to get very different timbres out of this. And that variation in timbre is a key part of how someone would play that. And it makes the part believable. And so I think in a lot of ways, when you take an instrument that has all the control of a continuum and you start thinking about for percussion, it's about how you simplify things. So you don't get in as much trouble. And again, sort of the expected gestures. You know, with sort of any instrument, making it easy for people to do something, and with percussionists, that's often splitting up hands. You know, with the exception of a kit drummer, we have two of these. We might use our fingers independently a little bit, but you aren't trying to do that many things at one time. So the stuff I keep coming back to, and part of this, I was telling Chris, is hard because I just saw a whole bunch of stuff in Ed's talk that had my head spinning about things I wanted to try. So it's like, oh, but I have to talk about something different now. And I think the setting and the performer are important, and especially if you're going to share the instrument with someone, or have someone play and try and do something for you on it. And set and setting, we talk about a lot in user interface design in the computer business, because things look and feel differently depending on where you're doing them. And so if you're doing something on stage, you know, you want to limit the options for I'm optimistically call it maximum success. It's minimizing the you know, chance of having a giant disaster. So, you know, thinking in terms of bigger zones, thinking, I had a friend who laid out a keyboard for doing this whole performance, and I need 5 notes per percussion. So I will stick the 5 bass notes down there. And then it's, you know, out at a place where it's hard to play. So you have to think about what your muscles are physically able to do. And then if these are radically different notes at the end of a keyboard, how likely are you to hit them right while you're doing other things at the same time? And you know, when bad things happen in front of an audience, they go bad really fast. You know, it's the rare person who's able to just sort of recover or come in on a bad note and go, just going to move past that. And you know, zones, and I think I really find limiting parameters to things that make sense. And that's probably the hardest thing I've had to learn across any sort of electronic music system is, you know, you think you want maximum dynamic range, you think you want maximum pitch control, you think you want all of these things, which are important to build into the native instrument so people have options. And then when you start thinking about percussion, and especially percussion on an instrument that's not a drum, you have to think in terms of how you limit those things to things that make sense, you know. The bull roar was a great example of that with, you know, if the pitch is up above this point, you don't need the oscillator. Is there a range of notes that make sense? Is there a safe place at either the high or low end? So if you know there's something that's going to be in tune or not obnoxiously out of tune, and you're trying to do something like a talking drum part, knowing that, you know, maximum pressure gets you to the safe place, you know, depending on what you're using for your volume control, that's a really comfortable thing to be able to go, I'm fishing for this thing and it's not quite right, and I'm just gonna lean on it hard and get there and be able to gain my composure. And that's probably as my brain goes off in different directions. But it's been really fascinating starting to think about just how you would build an electronic percussion instrument from scratch, and then sitting there with a continuum where you had like so many similar ideas in terms of taking a rich signal and passing it through things, and processing it, and then starting to think about how that maps back into these percussion elements. Because I think you can, for everyone who plays it, I approached the continuum initially. All the times I've played it, I've been thinking about it as a melodic instrument. And it really wasn't until I got the Mini and started digging through it and going, well, oh, fun, there are some percussion patches. Oh, well, what are they really doing? And then I took it out to an open mic night with a friend and got myself in a bunch of trouble with some of it, because you get unexpected things happening, and that's where a lot of this has come from. So that's why I have, sadly I don't have a great Egan Matrix example on some of this, because I'm still wrapping my head around it. The good news about it being so incredibly deep is you can do anything, and the bad news is I'm still working through being able to do interesting things with intent. So, thank you.
John, I got
Yeah.
a quick point. On percussion, one thing I found, and I'm sure Continuum players have as well, is the expression you can get from using multiple dimensions with automatic repeating of notes, kind of like an arpeggiator. And for doing multiple hi-hats, which people who are not drummers are not good at, repeated hi-hats or rolls and things like that, and you can get some wonderful things out of that. And that's sort of, I think, an extension of expression that you get from the wonderful ways, the thousands of ways that a percussionist can touch a drum and roll his finger or use a cuica or something like that.
Well, and this is one of the places, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the really magic things about an instrument like a continuum, and one of the places where MIDI is a complete disaster for this, is you could play with mod wheels, you could play with aftertouch, you could try a lot of these things to change the sound after it's been struck, but that really wasn't the intent of MIDI, and it hasn't gotten really much better with it. Whereas that being able to vary your volume a little bit, or shape the tone a little bit with an auto roll, one of the things that comes up with an automatic roll is, everyone has one on a drum machine, and someone goes and they lean on the button and they now get this perfect roll that's going out and doesn't change at all, and you immediately know the person's using a drum machine.
Yeah.
Right? And being able to do stuff like that on an instrument where you can actually vary the pressure and ride that a little bit, all of a sudden it becomes convincing. And it becomes sort of interesting.
Yeah, particularly when you got the 3 dimensions of control.
Yeah, and so that's a really good point. And that I had always sort of stayed away from the auto roll stuff, because there's certain sounds that have your music in a particular place and time. And so if you do that, people immediately go, oh, this is this.
But you can create a whole beat if you just take 3 zones, like kick, snare, and hi-hat, and just vary pressure on them and position, and you can get very natural things and things that the drummer couldn't do.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole other dimension to expression, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I have more things to think about.
Me too.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, what a great time to be alive that we have a lot of these instruments that you really can think in terms of expression rather than just, how I hit a button on the sound library and hopefully get something.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was just gonna add on that it seems like that could be a thing that could be applied to any kind of like sequencing or something too, is where you have something that is generating a sequence, but you're playing the manner in which it behaves. You have like real-time smooth control of what it's more likely to do or not.
Well, and one of the things I'll show tomorrow, or I'll have the Jambé out when we do jam sessions and that, is I can, you can put a sequence on a pad.
Yeah.
And then it advances through it as you hit it. So, a drummer can sit there and swing a walking bass line. But what they're sort of interacting with is when the notes happen, not what the note is. And this is sort of a whole nother dimension of that.
Have anyone who uses Continuum use that sort of like that? Where you have you just vary pressure and position, and then you use perhaps an external arpeggiator or something like that to repeat the notes.
I've used that.
In a sort of simplified way, you can think of all those shape generators as sequencers. They're just cyclical things that are, that if you didn't have any input to them, they'd be boring, but just the fact that you can change the speed and the influence of what they're doing in real time.
Of course, that sort of acts as an arpeggiato or repeat.
Yeah.
So another place where continuous change is, it seems obvious with hindsight, but in the sustain and sostenuto pedals, we make those continuous, and it's a similar effect. You get all sorts of things out of a sustain pedal if you just make it continuous that normally a sustain is sort of boring.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I use that a lot. It's great.
But I think that's where limit options comes into play, though. You need to not set everything at the full scale, right? You scale it to a musical plus a little, right?
Yeah.
You go to 11 instead of 10, but you don't go to 128 or whatever.
Yeah, quantization gets a bad name for a good reason. But being able to really limit stuff back to the point where all your choices are good choices is not a bad thing. So yeah, I that would definitely be a place where you don't want to be able to push it so far out of things. And that's particularly would probably be true with the repeats, right? That at a certain point it stops being musically interesting and yeah.
That's a tricky part of sound design that I find when I do things for the Continuum, is that you can put those limits in place, but oftentimes it may sacrifice some other aspect of it. The whole system becomes too complex, and it's almost like you can have a sound that can give you some very unmusical results, but it's almost like you just say, well, like when the doctor says, it hurts when I do this. Well, don't do that, that kind of aspect. It's really hard to make all those limits, especially in the physical modeling aspects of things.
Yeah.
Well, one way to get around it maybe is not to just contain the possibilities, but to use some kind of logarithmic scale so that a greater resolution exists in most of the range of what you're doing, and then the wild shit, is on the far end.
The problem is dimensionality of that. Like all these things cross-relate. So as soon as you limit one system, you're going to affect wonderful possibilities. It's really hard. The system ends up being really complex.
Yeah.
But for instance, for rounding, there's sounds that Ed does. Ed is not big on rounding, but there's like these things that are clusters of, chorusy clusters of oscillators or something. You just can't hear the pitch center well enough to tell. I mean, you have to have the rounding to play into it.
Yeah.
And the other thing is with percussion, at least, or anything that has long release rate, you've lifted your finger. You're not going to be able to correct any pitch anymore, and it can be very painful if there's no rounding going on at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of really basic situations where you really always need it.
Well, and that's the other thing that I'm, this will be another conversation I need to have with Ed. you know, for a lot of percussion sounds, it's either a short thing and you hit it and you come off of it, it's fine. But there's a whole class of percussion things like gongs and bells and that you hit it and the sound's now going to go. And the intended behavior is not that I'm going to sit there and continue to mutate that, but I want to hit it and it's going to go. And then at some point I need to stop it. And so a lot of this, it's interesting how you fit these things in because it's a completely different method of sound generation from a lot of instruments where when I move to the next note, I move to the next note.
Mhm.
Anyhow, we're 2 minutes over lunchtime.